The alien queen wept for her fallen sister, unaware a human had saved her life. The flame-and red queen Sira walked alone through the ruins of Ashthorn Reach, where the wind howled not through mountains but through melted war machines and shattered obelisks. The battlefield had been silent for years, yet the ground still breathed memories beneath her boots, the soil blackened from plasma and pain. This was where they said her sister had died, buried beneath the wreckage of the Ninth Fleet's command cruiser, lost when the final orbital barrage tore through sky and stone. They never recovered a body, only fragments of armor and the broken remnants of a royal insignia, bent at the edges as if by sorrow itself. No one had dared follow her today. The queen had left her palace in silence, no escort, no royal guard wearing not the silk black regalia of a sovereign but the pale mourning robes of her youth, the same kind her sister used to wear. Saria, bold and brazen, forever challenging her to keep her heart open even as the galaxy darkened. Together they had once ruled as flame and wind, one deliberate, the other wild. Together they had been unstoppable, until the war tore everything apart and left Sira alone with a throne that felt more like a tomb. The grave site was not marked by name or monument, but by a single obsidian shard half buried in the dust. She had placed it herself the day after the ceasefire, when the council declared Saria among the fallen and told her to begin healing, as if mourning could be scheduled, as if the absence of a body meant anything to a bond that had existed since the womb. Salira knelt slowly before the stone, brushing her fingers across its cracked edge, her gloves slipping off one by one until bare skin met the cold. The wind tugged at her braids and the silence pressed down like judgment. "I promised I'd keep you safe," she whispered, her voice breaking at the end, "even if it meant breaking the stars, and I failed you." She reached into her robe and drew out a small pendant, twin to the one Saria had always worn, a teardrop of living crystal linked by birth and blood, meant to glow whenever the other was near. For years it had remained dark, as silent as the grave. She held it close, watching the glassy surface reflect her tear-stained face. "If I had just told you to stay," she continued, staring down at the shard. "If I hadn't let you take the rear flank, maybe this wouldn't be our last conversation." The moons began to rise, casting twin shadows across the field, and with it the icy night air crept around her. Still she didn't move, didn't flinch when the cold bit into her skin or when the wind carried whispers of war. She stayed because she could not leave, not while her sister remained missing beneath the ground and her guilt had roots deeper than any empire. There were no words left, only breath, only sorrow, only silence. And somewhere beneath that silence, something pulls faintly. The pendant trembled once in her hand, but by the time she noticed, the light was gone again, and she told herself it was the cold playing tricks because anything else would be too impossible to hope for. Sergeant Leon Hart had stopped believing in rescue the day the ceasefire was declared. The orders had come down swift and heartless, no retrievals, no backtracking, no salvaging survivors. It had been a war of attrition, a galactic meat grinder that swallowed both alien and human blood alike. And when peace came, it was the kind that asked for forgetfulness, not justice. But Leon couldn't forget not the cry he'd heard while patrolling the wreckage near the crater fields, a voice so faint, so broken it barely sounded alive. He found her half buried beneath twisted beams of an alien battleship, blood thick and blue where it clung to shattered armor. Her breathing was shallow, more memory than breath, and her fingers twitched like she was still fighting some invisible enemy. He thought she was dead until her eye fluttered open and stared at him with a fury that defied the grave. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Everything about her screamed, "I am not done yet." Leon didn't know who she was. He didn't know the language carved into the breastplate or the significance of the shattered crest pressed against her heart. But something told him that this wasn't just a soldier. There was gravity in her presence, even bleeding out and unconscious. Like the air bent slightly around her refusal to die, he should have called for command, should have marked her for retrieval by the next diplomatic team, or left her for the crows of bureaucracy. But he didn't. Instead, he tore away the debris, lifted her into his arms, and carried her across half a ruined valley to the edge of an old Terran outpost that had been abandoned months ago. There, beneath malfunctioning ceiling lights and broken air purifiers, he set her down and began to patch what he could. He knew enough medic to stop the bleeding, enough triage to stabilize her lungs. Every time he cleaned a wound or reset a broken rib, she winced but did not cry out, even unconscious. She fought sleep like it was a predator trying to steal her spirit. When she woke days later, she didn't thank him. She stared at him, untrusting, unsure, eyes dark and alert. Her voice, when it came, was rough from the fire and laced with hesitation. "Where am I?" Leon sat back in his chair and shrugged. "Nowhere and safe. That's all that matters." She tried to rise, and he gently pushed her down. "You're not going anywhere. Your blood's still drying." She watched him, confused and strangely calm. "Why did you save me?" He didn't have an answer, not a good one, but he told the truth. "Because you didn't look like someone who was supposed to die." She blinked slowly, absorbing the words. Then she turned her head away. Over the next few days, she didn't speak much, but she didn't leave either. Her body healed, but her mind remained behind closed doors. She didn't tell him her name, only that she had once stood where stars were commanded and that everything she remembered ended in flame. So he called her Ember, because even buried in ash, she still burned, and somewhere deep inside, he knew this was no ordinary survivor. This was the kind of soul wars could not erase, even if her world had tried. The Terran outpost had become a strange kind of sanctuary, its half-flickering lights and rusted walls housing the ghost of a woman who should not have been alive. Leon fixed what he could in the ruins: power relays, water filters, med units cobbled together from war scrap, but he could not fix the weight that clung to Ember's every breath. She walked the compound like someone haunting her own grave, saying little, watching the skies with a tension in her shoulders that never left. The first few days were a fog of healing, but on the 7th, she stood before the broken satellite array and whispered something he didn't catch. The shard around her neck, he hadn't noticed it before, tucked beneath her half-shredded armor, began to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat. It was made of crystal he didn't recognize, alien in shape, carved with runes that shimmered only when the stars overhead aligned just right. When he asked what it was, she stiffened, then slowly unclasped it, holding it as if it were alive. "It should not be glowing," she said in a voice touched by something colder than fear. "Not unless." Her words trailed off, but he saw the dread creep into her features like ink spreading through water. "Not unless she's alive." Leon stood still. "Who?" "My sister." She didn't speak her name, she didn't need to. In that moment, the war-torn fields of distant galaxies felt closer than the walls of their shelter. Ember Saria, though she had yet to reclaim it, closed her hand around the crystal as if she could crush the grief out of it. And when she finally met his eyes again, it was as if another veil had fallen. "They told her I was dead." "I felt it." Leon understood without being told. He'd seen it before: soldiers marked Kier without confirmation, families mourning empty graves, medals delivered to next of kin with no body behind the box. But this was different. "What happens if she knows you're alive?" he asked quietly. Ember looked at him, and for a moment her mask dropped. There was no flame, no command, just a flicker of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "She won't stop until she finds me." And neither would Ember. Not anymore. Across the stars, in the high halls of the Elandon Citadel, Queen Sira woke before dawn with a jolt, her breath caught in her throat, her pulse racing like thunder beneath her skin. The pendant beneath her royal collar had glowed again, this time stronger, longer, undeniable. For years it had been dormant, a lifeless relic of a bond severed by war. But now it pulsed with a regular rhythm, desperate, flickering like a signal, begging to be heard. She rose from her bed without a word and crossed the obsidian chamber to the vault, a door that only opened to her blood. It hissed open at her presence, revealing the central relic altar where her sister's pendant should have lain lifeless in its containment cradle. But it wasn't dark anymore. It shimmered like it was breathing. Celira reached for it with shaking hands. Her heart wanted to believe, but her mind screamed against the pain of false hope. She had buried Saria in her heart because there had been no remains to bury in the soil. She had knelt beside that obsidian shard for years and told herself silence was the only answer left. But this wasn't silence. This was noise, fractured and faint, but alive. She summoned the royal archivist, demanding trace logs, signal records, anything that could confirm an activation of the twin bond technology woven into the crystal lattice of the pendant. They found nothing in their systems, no registry had pinged, but the artifact didn't lie. It pulsed again when she brought her hand near, a faint echoing vibration through bone and memory. "This is not possible," one aide whispered. "No," Celira said, voice steady despite the storm within her. "This is truth, and I will follow it." She canceled her meetings, dismissed the court, and closed the council's doors with the force of a monarch who would not tolerate delay. The old fleet captain, Vexamar, stood at her side by midday, armor polished, eyes skeptical. "You're chasing shadows, my queen," he warned. "I chased shadows once," she replied, fastening the crystal to her armor. "And I buried one without proof. Never again." She boarded the Ark-class vessel with only a skeleton crew, ignoring every diplomatic protest, every procedural delay. The palace gates had never seen her depart so fast. Across the stars, her flagship roared to life, quiet, sleek, and driven by a rage even the throne could not extinguish. She didn't know where her sister was yet. The shard signal was scattered, erratic, pulled thin through interference and time. But it was hers. It was hers, and if the stars were merciful, the grave would soon be proven a lie. The queen of 1,000 systems flew not to rule, but to find. The flame she had mourned in the silence of broken stone, the wreckage outside had long since surrendered to time, fields of twisted metal blanketed by ash storms, the bones of war rusting beneath a gray sky that never remembered peace. But within the quiet outpost, nestled on the edge of the forgotten moon, warmth flickered between two unlikely souls. Leon stood at the workbench, soldering broken circuits by hand, trying to coax life back into the ancient satellite dish perched on the station's roof. He didn't say much anymore, not because he had no words, but because he knew she didn't need them. Ember moved through the corridors like someone unlearning how to be hunted. Her steps were sure now, no longer staggered by pain or fear. She wore her scars like a banner, her silence like a shield. But Leon had learned to read the way her shoulders tensed before memories returned. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, she would murmur names in a language he didn't understand, names that never returned her call. The pendant at her throat pulsed erratically now, as though impatient, as though it knew time was thinning between worlds. She joined him that evening on the roof, her breath steaming in the brittle air. Above them, stars spilled across the sky in a river of light neither of them could name. She stared up, her arms crossed against the chill. "I remember her voice," Ember said suddenly, and the way she said my name made the stars seem to slow. Leon didn't look at her. He knew better than to break that fragile thread when it finally surfaced. He waited. "She used to sing to me before we stood trial for succession. Not lullabies, were songs. Songs written in the dialect of old queens, who died with swords in their hands." Ember's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but as if trying to trap the sound within her skull again. "She told me once that I burned too bright, that I'd either become a legend or disappear in flame." "You did both," Leon said. Ember turned to him. "But I didn't disappear, did I?" "No," he replied. "You just got lost. There's a difference." She reached into her pocket and pulled the shard free again, holding it out to the open air like it could drink the sky. The light within it pulsed slowly, then faster, then still. Leon leaned forward. "You sure it's not damaged?" "No," she said. "It's waiting. It knows she's coming." Leon glanced down at the soldered panel beside him. The satellite dish was still humming with barely held connections. The transmission array was old, brittle, and only partially responsive to modern uplink commands. But he'd been working on it for days, rewiring frequency dampeners and hijacking subspace pings from the nearest relay drift. If what she suspected was true, if her sister really was alive and searching, then every whisper from this moon could be the signal that pulled them together again. "I need to do more," he said suddenly. Ember raised an eyebrow. "You already saved me." Leon stood and tightened his tool belt. "I didn't save her. Not yet." He descended the ladder with a fire she hadn't seen in him before. And for the first time since she'd emerged from the rubble, Ember stood still, heart thudding not in fear but in hope that refused to be extinguished. Hope shaped like a human. Hope shaped like home. Queen Sira sat in the command chamber of the Ark-class starship Virilion, her eyes fixed on the forward screen as starfields bent and unfurled before her. They had been chasing echoes for days, phantom readings, signal spikes, gravitational oddities that danced just out of alignment with known charts. Her crew watched her carefully. None dared question her urgency, but all of them felt the tension that lived in her shoulders and behind her royal silence. She hadn't slept, not really. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Seria's laugh. Not the one from court appearances or ceremonies, but the one only sisters knew, the breathless, wild one that came when they ran through palace corridors barefoot at midnight, hiding from duty, pretending to be children again. It haunted her. but it also gave her fuel. Every flicker of the shard pendant she wore was like a countdown, a signal not from the dead but from the lost. She stood at the bridge's edge, fingers curled around the railing, as her second-in-command, Commander Onra, approached with an update. "We've located a pulse, Your Majesty, consistent with Varen crystal bonding. Code signature is partial but real. Location: a shattered moon at the edge of the drift belt. Abandoned outpost. No confirmed colonies. Records suggest it was used as a Terran evac shelter during the ceasefire." Syra's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Set course. Full speed. Your Majesty, if it is her, and she's alive, why hasn't she come to us?" Syra didn't turn. Her grip on the pendant tightened. "Because if she's alive, someone didn't want us to know." Onra hesitated, then nodded. The order was given. Virillion adjusted trajectory, slipping through subspace like a ghost returning to a memory. The crew moved with a silence born not of fear but reverence, for they understood something now that had only been speculation before. This was not a queen-chasing delusion. This was a sister answering a call. As they approached the drift belt, the readings became clearer. Energy signatures danced like fire across the sensors, wild and unpredictable. The crystal shard now glowed constantly against her chest, no longer pulsing but flaring, as though the bond between them had never truly broken. Celira felt it down to her marrow. Her sister was near. She stepped into her private chamber, removed her crown, and placed it carefully on the marble pedestal near her window. Then she stared out at the moon they were approaching, scarred, desolate, shrouded in mist. "You always were stubborn," she whispered aloud. "But I'm here now." The ship slowed its descent, lowering into the atmosphere with quiet precision. Exterior cams captured the jagged terrain, the flickering lights of an outpost long since forgotten. And there, walking across the frost-covered roof, was a figure draped in gray, her face turned skyward, eyes waiting. Syra's breath caught. Her hand lifted to the pendant. The bond had spoken, and Syria was no longer just a memory. She was alive. The ship descended through the shroud of the forgotten moon like a memory piercing a long-forgotten wound. Wind tore across the craters, stirring the old ash into spirals as the Virillion's landing gear kissed the fractured rock with practiced grace. The engines hummed low, quiet, reverent, as if even the ship knew it approached something holy. On the frost-slick roof of the outpost, Syria stood with her face turned skyward and her fingers clutched tightly around the crystal shard that had not stopped burning since the ship entered orbit. Leon stood beside her, breath fogging, arms crossed, the familiar rifle slung across his back, though he knew it wouldn't be needed. He'd watched her all morning, watched the stillness in her, the way she held herself not as a refugee but as someone ready to be found. She hadn't said a word since the sensor ray began blinking erratically, since the crystal sang like a beacon struck by thunder. Then she stepped forward, eyes locked on the descending ramp as it extended from the Virillion's underbelly. No guards emerged. No fanfare, just the quiet hiss of pressure equalizing and the soft impact of boots on metal. The queen stepped into the cold with nothing but her breath and memory to armor her. No crown, no retinue. Her cloak whipped around her as if the wind recognized its rightful monarch. For a heartbeat, she didn't breathe, afraid that if she did, the vision would vanish like all the dreams that had tormented her since the war. Syria didn't move. She stood in the center of the rooftop, the ash at her feet swirling like something sacred had awakened in the ground. The queen stopped 5 paces from her, eyes wide, hands trembling. "I thought you were." Her voice cracked, the words strangled by years of grief and disbelief. "I know," Syria replied, her voice softer than the wind and heavier than stone. It was like staring into a reflection dulled only by years, not difference. Their faces mirrored each other, both sharper now, forged by fire, carved by mourning. But the bond between them pulsed like it had never frayed. Celira took another step forward. "They gave me your crest, burned, bent, said you had no remains to return." "I had none left to give," Syria said. "Not to them, but to him." The queen glanced toward Leon. He carried what the galaxy discarded. Leon stood silent, eyes low, letting them speak the truth that could only pass between sisters. For a long moment, nothing moved. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Celira dropped to her knees. Her cloak spilled into the ash like ink across snow. Her voice cracked into something neither royal nor rehearsed. "I buried you in silence, and I woke in it," Syria answered, stepping forward until they were face to face. She knelt too, lifting the crystal and placing it into Sire's hand. "You never stopped looking, and you never stopped surviving." Their foreheads touched, and the bond flared between them, not the glow of a crystal, but the kind of light that lives only in the soul when something broken becomes whole again. No one moved. No one breathed. And somewhere in the universe, the wound of war closed just a little. Inside the outpost, the reunion carried into silence. There were no grand declarations, no recordings, just the slow unraveling of pain between two hearts that had once beat in tandem and then beat alone for too long. Sira walked the corridors like a woman rediscovering pieces of a cathedral left behind in her youth. She touched the walls where Saria had healed, the makeshift medbed where she had slept. She knelt beside the table Leon had crafted from old starship hull and ran her fingers over the edges. It wasn't royal, it wasn't protocol, but it was sacred. Saria watched her without speaking, her eyes never far from the soldier who had refused to let her die. Leon avoided their glances at first, unsure of what space he occupied in a story that now stretched beyond his reach. He had saved a life, yes, but the magnitude of what he had returned was only now becoming clear. Word spread before the Virillion ever departed. Whispers turned into roars across systems. The heir of fire, once presumed dead, carved into stone, mourned in the ashes of memory, had returned. Systems once aligned against the crown paused in uncertainty. Fleets waiting for weakness began to second-guess their timing. Because Saria Varen had not only survived the war, she had walked through death and found a human who saw her not as royalty but as someone worth saving. The palace back on the Citadel was flooded with diplomatic inquiries, security alerts, territorial demands. But Celira ignored them all. She sat with Saria and Leon beneath the stars on the outpost roof, sharing the last ration bars and a silence older than memory. "Do you want to come back?" Celira asked quietly, her voice nearly lost to the breeze. Saria looked at the sky. "Do I still belong?" "More than anyone," Celira said. "But only if you choose it." Saria turned to Leon. "Would you come with me?" He didn't flinch. "If you ask me to." "I'm not asking," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm telling you, I'm not going back without the one person who believed I was more than what I lost." So he stood, and with him stood the weight of an entire empire about to change. When they returned, they didn't do so in triumph, but in truth. Together, a queen, a sister, and a Terran soldier whose only weapon had been his refusal to give up on someone everyone else had left behind. The galaxy would not understand it. The council would resist it. Enemies would plot and allies would stumble over the implications. But none of it mattered, because for the first time since the war ended, the House of Flames stood whole, and the fire between them had never been brighter. The approach to Alandon Citadel was unlike anything the Terran soldier had ever seen. From the viewport of the Virillion, the planet shimmered with crownfire storms across its upper atmosphere, a natural phenomenon known to burn violet and blue when the twin moons aligned, a rare event said to mark fate's great crossings. Leon stood at the edge of the command deck, uncertain of his place in all this, watching as the world below bloomed like a celestial jewel. Beside him stood Saria, cloaked now not in shadow but in a quiet strength that drew the eyes of even the most hardened royal guards. Celira gave no speech as they descended. She didn't need to. The visual alone of the two sisters walking side by side again carried more weight than 1,000 decrees. The ceremonial gates of the palace opened without command, without trumpets, without any of the rigid protocol that had once ruled their lives. People lined the corridors not because they were summoned, but because word had spread like thunder across systems. The dead had returned. No one moved. No one dared breathe as Saria crossed the polished onyx floor of the grand hall, her bare hands brushing the war banners that still hung in memory of her supposed death. She didn't look at them, she didn't need to. They were shadows, beautiful, respectful, wrong. At the center of the chamber stood the marble monument carved in her name, surrounded by candles, etched with words of mourning written by a world that believed it had lost its flame. Saria walked up to it, stared for a long, still moment, then touched her fingers to the edge of her own sculpted face. And with one motion, she shattered it. The monument cracked down the middle, not with violence, but with purpose. The sound rang like truth across the hall. Whispers broke out among the nobles and ambassadors gathered, the sound of centuries old. Etiquette dissolving into stunned silence. Celira said nothing. She watched her sister reclaim the narrative of her life not from history, not from tradition, but from death itself. The royal court erupted in chaos within hours. Half the High Lords demanded clarification on succession rights. The Council of Thrones called an emergency session. Foreign emissaries sent frantic reports back to their dominions, unsure whether the return of a living legend meant war, peace, or something they could not name. And through it all, Saria remained silent. It was Leon who spoke first, when no one else dared. I didn't save her to watch you all rewrite her again, he said, standing before the council without armor, without title. I didn't carry her through fire so she could be placed back in a cage made of protocol. He wasn't royal. He wasn't a Landon. But his voice rang louder than those born with galaxies in their blood. The queen rose from her throne. He speaks as one who knows the weight of silence, Sira said, her eyes scanning the chamber. And I tell you this, if anyone here dares reduce my sister to a political tool again, you will be met not with negotiation but exile. The hall fell into a hush too heavy for words. Later, when the chamber emptied and the stars began to climb the palace windows, the sisters stood in the moonlight. Saria looked at Sira, then at Leon, then at the hall still echoing with the voice of rebellion. You always ruled for them, Saria said softly. But today you ruled for me. Sira exhaled like she hadn't done in years. I'm just glad I finally got you back. And for the first time since the war, neither one of them wept. The days that followed became legend before they were even written. Saria did not reclaim her former title. She did not resume her place on the throne beside her sister. Instead, she walked the outer cities of Alandon in simple robes, holding conversations with the people who had once mourned her, now too stunned to approach without trembling hands. To the children born after the war, she was a story made flesh. To the elders, she was the echo of hope they had long given up. And to the fire-hearted youth who had studied her war records in secret, she was proof that survival was not weakness but legacy. Leon became an enigma in palace circles. They called him the Keeper of the Flame, the Terran Ghost, the Silent Sentinel. And though many courtiers attempted to speak to him, probe him, place him inside some role, he stayed mostly to himself, close to Saria always, just a few steps behind her, not guarding, not possessing, but witnessing. There were no parades, no coronations, no speeches carved into crystal walls. Instead, Saria walked into the old Hall of Doctrine one morning and pressed her palm to the archives. She opened her own file, and there, before dozens of scholars and historians, she rewrote the final line, presumed lost, she erased. And in its place she wrote, rescued by a Terran soldier who did not ask for reward, who did not ask for my name, who did not ask what I could offer him. He simply carried me until I remembered who I was. The galaxy paused that day. Entire fleets ran, silent as the news transmitted across the stars in 100 languages, across 1,000 systems. It was read aloud, and though some mocked it, others wept. On Earth, a bronze monument was erected quietly outside the Intergalactic Peace Memorial. No speech, no plaque, just a flame carved into stone and 2 sets of footsteps pressed into the base. One large, one light. Back on Alandon, the sisters walked the quiet gardens one evening, the same place they had played as children, the same place they had first promised to never lose each other. I don't belong to war anymore, Saria said. You never did, Salira answered. They turned to Leon, who watched them with the same calm he'd carried since that first day in the ashes. What about you? Saria asked.